Hello, and welcome to the Kofford Lecture Series. Tonight's live streaming is part of an ongoing series of discussions that is held with our authors on a variety of topics. If you are interested in checking out any of our past live stream discussions, they are archived on our podcast, which is the Greg Kofford Book Authorcast. That is available through most podcast players or on our website at gregkofford.com. I'm going to go ahead and just drop a link in the comments real quick here. And we are also putting these on YouTube, so be sure to subscribe to us over on there. Just search for Greg Kofford Books. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome Mike Austin. Mike is the author of several books, including Buried Treasures, Reading the Book of Mormon Again for the First Time, Rereading Job, Understanding the Ancient World's Greatest Poem, as well as the series co-editor of the Mormon Image in Literature, and many, many other books outside of Mormon studies. Mike is also a permablogger with By Common Consent. Most of you have probably known him from over there and read his excellent blogs, and serves as a board chair for Dialogue, Journal of Mormon Thought, as well as the editorial team for BCC Press. Tonight, we will be discussing Mike's award-winning book, Rereading Job. Mike, thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you very much, Brian.
Great. Now we can hear you.
Get me with pandemic hair. Sorry.
That's okay. I'm working on my pandemic beard, so we can both be frilly haired together. Let me go ahead and drop a link into the comments for Rereading Job as well, if anybody would like to check that out. So just a couple of quick announcements before we get started with tonight's discussion. We are pleased to offer 30% off Rereading Job through our website at gregkofford.com. I just dropped a link to that in the comments if you want to take a look at that. All you need to do is enter the discount code JOB2020. And I'll go ahead and put that in the comments as well. JOB2020, all one word, all capital letters. That will get you 30% off the book. Let me see if I can also put that up on the screen real quick. You have all this, we have all this fancy technology. We might as well use it. Job 2020. Oh, it didn't take. Hold on. There we go. Again, just put Job 2020 in the discount box at checkout and you'll get 30% off Rereading Job. That code should be valid for at least a week. We will be uploading this interview as a podcast probably early next week. And so it'll probably be good for a week after that. So probably a week from next Tuesday. Now that I made that nice and confusing. Speaking of sales, we are also going to be starting, it's not started yet, but we're going to be starting a back to church sale. And we say that a little bit facetiously through the month of June on select titles. This is something you can check out on our website. Again, it's beginning Monday, June 1st, and it's running through the whole month. So head over to gregkofford.com for that. Finally, for those who are joining us live, we welcome your comments and your questions and feedback for Mike, and we're going to try to incorporate those in as we go along. Also, be sure to give this live video a love or a like. Hopefully not a sad face or an angry face, but it helps us to be able to get a little more visibility on the streaming platform. If you could hit a love or like, or if you are so bold, if you even want to share it to help us to try to expand a wider audience tonight, we would greatly appreciate that as well. All right, now that we have all of that out of the way, are you ready to discuss Job, Mike?
Let's do it.
All right. Before we get into the questions that we've sort of discussed beforehand, there was a funny little story about when we set up this this interview or this lecture, something to do with you putting it in your calendar. Can you tell us a little bit about this story?
Yeah. So when you emailed me and asked me to do this, it was probably a week and a half ago. I'm working at home. My administrative assistant is working at home right now. So I have to keep my own calendar for events. I just can't shout in the other room and have her put in something into my calendar. So I put in for tonight that I was going to be doing a Job interview because Brian said he would like to interview me about the book of Job and about my book on the book of Job. So I just put Job interview in my calendar, forgetting that other people, and actually 3 or 4 other people, have access to my calendar. I'm an academic administrator by day, and so several people have access to the calendar. And so a couple of days later, I was on the phone with my administrative assistant, and I could tell there was something she wanted to tell me. And finally, I said, "Okay, what's going on, Toby?" And she said, "Well, I just want to wish you good luck in your job interview, but I sure hope you don't go." And then I explained to her that it was not a job interview; it was a Job interview, and very few Job interviews lead to jobs. And then I actually put that little story on my Facebook feed, and a friend of mine from here in Evansville, who is a rabbi, commented and said, "Oh, yes, they do. I got my job by talking about Job." So
that's great.
That's the story.
That's truly a funny story. All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and get into some of the questions?
Okay, let's do it.
Let's begin with just some dating stuff. Let's talk about when the book of Job was probably composed.
We have no idea. I mean, we can guess. There are actually theories about it that go anywhere from 200 BC to 1200 BC, depending on who you ask and why. The strong likelihood is that it was composed after the Babylonian captivity and after Cyrus the Great let the Jews go back and build the temple, so that Job comes probably from around 400-ish BC. It comes from the Persian period, and the reason for that is that the setup for Job is very much has all of the marks of a Persian story. The figure of Satan in Job, who is not actually the author of all evil, he is a sort of a court figure who goes around trying to trip up people and get them to be disloyal to the king. There actually was such a person in the Persian Empire. That was an office of a person called the Eyes of the King, who would kind of go around and spy on people and see if he could get people to deny the king or to speak against the king, and then he would go to the king's court and denounce the person. And this is how the Persian kings kept their satraps in order. So the figure of Job shows a strong Persian influence in that first 2 chapters. So it's very, very likely that it was after 521, I think it was, when the Persians, and after they'd been there for a while and set up their governing system, because the story seems to have a Persian component.
That makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about genre. I think that's one of the big questions that you really wanted to be able to tackle tonight. So let's just go ahead and do it early. What is the genre of the book of Job, and why does that matter?
Okay, I think this is the fundamental question with Job, and it's really the fundamental question in almost every book of the Old Testament and most of the books in the New Testament. In order to read them correctly, we have to understand what kind of book they are, what kinds of expectations their original readers would have brought to them. So I'm going to tell a story. Can I tell a story? You've gone away, so I can tell a story. Let's just imagine. We're going to just imagine that I gave you a story, and this was a story about a policeman visiting a friend's house, and from the upstairs room, you hear somebody shout, "I'm going to kill you," followed by 2 gunshots. The policeman runs up the stairs, finds a locked door, forces it open, goes inside, and sees Mr. Brown standing over a dead Mr. Jones, holding a gun, a smoking gun, and saying maniacally, "I got you, Jones, I got you." What do you conclude about Mr. Brown and Mr. Jones from this story?
I would conclude that there was some sort of manslaughter.
Okay. Do you think Mr. Brown killed Mr. Jones?
It seems that the smoking gun would tell me so.
Okay, I'm going to give you two hypotheses about how you would respond. If this were a newspaper story, there would be absolutely no doubt that Mr. Brown killed Mr. Jones, because we know in a newspaper story that there's really no other option. This is a story about how Mr. Brown killed Mr. Jones. If these were the opening pages of a mystery novel, you would absolutely know that Mr. Brown is the only person who couldn't have killed Mr. Jones. Because the person who looks like they did it on the first page of a mystery novel cannot be the person who did it, because otherwise there's no novel. So if this is an Agatha Christie novel, you know that Mr. Brown is innocent and that all of this is going to be explained. This is a newspaper, you know that Mr. Brown is guilty, and there's no possible way that he could have done otherwise, that anybody else could have killed Mr. Jones. The genre completely determines how you read the story. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, is Job a mystery novel or a newspaper? It makes a difference. If I gave you a newspaper or a mystery novel, you would know which one was which, because you grew up in this culture. You know what the genre markers are. You know what newspapers look like. You know what mystery novels look like. Even if I just gave you the typed out text, you know how newspapers sound and you know how mystery novels sound. So you would be able to read that story even without any other context and make assumptions about it, because you would immediately recognize the genre convention. If 5,000 years in the future, somebody discovers this story of Mr. Jones and Mr. Brown, they will have no way to read it. And so if they can't understand the original genre convention, they're not going to get what the story is. Job is exactly like that. Job is actually multi-generic. It's two genres. The first two chapters and about the last half of the last chapter, chapter 42, are a fairy tale. I mean, it has all of the markers of a fairy tale. It begins with the Hebrew equivalent of once upon a time. It has characters that are in roles that are very different than we would expect if this were a historical story. So that story is self-contained. You could actually cut out most of the book of Job and just read the first two chapters and then the last half of the last chapter, and that would be a complete story. It would be a short story. It would be a very easy story to read. The prose is very easy to read, and it has all of the markings of a tale that nobody at the time would have said, well, this is historical. This happened. This is actually what God did. God went down and God made this bet with Satan. And everyone knows that that's not how it went. They would have understood this is a fairy tale. Then something happens when we start book 3 in Job. And if we're reading the King James Version, we're probably going to miss it, because the King James Version flattens the language. It elevates almost all of the prose to poetic diction, but it prints everything as prose. So you can't tell if you're reading any other Bible translation, you can tell when a verse is prose and when a verse is Hebrew poetry, because all modern translations make that distinction. And so you can see, if you're just looking on the page, that here in chapter 3, it goes from being a very, very simple story to a torturously complex poem. And the poem is what we call a wisdom dialogue. And that is a Hebrew genre. It was a Near Eastern genre, actually. So there are wisdom dialogues from Assyria. There are wisdom dialogues from Babylon. It's actually fairly close to the Socratic dialogue that we see in the writings of Plato. So this wisdom dialogue is a poem in which different interlocutors engage with each other and tease out through their positions some statement that the author wants to make. So you get this very, very torturous, extremely complicated, very difficult language poem that's in the middle of this simple prose story. So let me give you kind of another example, and I use this example in the book. Imagine that a very devout feminist avant-garde filmmaker takes the Disney version of Cinderella, and we'll assume that it's in the public domain when this happens, because otherwise Disney would just sue them and it would be over. Movie, and then right before the big happy ending breaks, which is a very modern, very feminist poem that says, look at what a rotten society I live in. All that a woman is good for is either being married or being a scullery maid, and I've been a scullery maid all my life, and then I go to a ball, and this prince dances with me and supposedly falls in love with me, except he doesn't remember what I look like. So he has to go around trying on shoes because the only value I have right now is small feet. And just does this scathing critique of Disney's version of Cinderella, and then lets it go to the end where you have the happily ever after. Well, that happily ever after has already been deconstructed by the poem that's inserted in the middle. So that's what we have with Job. We have a fairy tale, which has all of the genre markers of a fairy tale. And in the middle of it, a poet comes in, and the poet absolutely does not believe in the ideology of the fairy tale. The ideology of the fairy tale is Job was calm, he was quiet, he accepted everything that God did to him, he didn't complain, and so he got his big reward at the end. Thus we see we should be patient and we should not complain. And then you get a poem that's like 38 chapters of Job complaining and cursing God and arguing with God and declaring that God is not just. You get the poet doing all of the things that the frame says the poet isn't supposed to do, and in the process we get a wonderful exploration of what is probably the central cultural narrative that emerges in the Babylonian captivity, and that is that the Jews were punished with captivity because they disobeyed God. They disobeyed God. That's why they were taken captive. The whole Deuteronomistic history is arranged around this idea, around this argument. We sinned. We worshiped false gods. It was our fault. Therefore, we were punished. And here Job comes in, and Job is testing the proposition of an innocent sufferer, somebody who is suffering for no particular reason, and his friends simply cannot accept it. So they keep arguing with him. They keep telling him there must be a discernible reason for his suffering, because if there isn't, then their worldview is no good. The worldview that God rewards those who are good and punishes those who are bad in obvious and easily traceable ways. And if that worldview is not correct, then they don't have anything to live their lives by. That's the guide star of their lives. So they have to force Job to be guilty of something. Otherwise, they have to abandon the core belief of their identity. And that core belief is the same core belief that most of the Job poets' culture believes about God, that the material condition of the Jews in the Babylonian captivity is a direct result of their breaking the covenant with God. And so the Job poet is actually a dangerous, unorthodox revolutionary who is telling the culture, that thing you believe, that's how you're organizing your entire society? Yeah, that's not true.
Well, you've answered every question that I have. So thank you for joining us this evening.
Okay.
No, let me back up a little bit here, because you've given us some really good information about where this sits within genre and within its time. You said that it has a Persian feel to it in form. And then one of the things that you said that I want to pick up on a little bit, I think you referred to it, what did you say, as a wisdom text?
It's a wisdom text, yes.
So wisdom text. Now, you said that the form of it is that you have kind of this encapsulated story that's bookmarked from the beginning and the end, right?
And that story probably existed before the poem. That was probably a story, could have been Jewish, could have been Persian, but yeah, that story almost certainly pre-existed the poem Job.
And then in the middle, you have this this piece that's sort of contending with this story, sort of breaking it up and contending with it, right? Now, it's very interesting to me that it's placed in the middle as opposed to a response after. Now, is that something that you see within wisdom writings, or is that a genre marker?
Not really. I mean, the poem, the wisdom poem, looks like a lot of other wisdom texts, but putting it in the middle of what is probably an existing story, that was just a really cool innovation by the writer. I mean, that was just a major badass move by a brilliant poet to, rather than refute a popular story, to retell the story in a way that made it refute itself. That's the genius of Job. The Job poet intentionally created this poem to do what we would now call a deconstruction of a myth, of a culture's myth, to show it up, to bang it against itself and show that the story as told doesn't make sense.
So this may have been the first instance of a postmodernist poet.
Probably, I mean, definitely one. I mean, pre-postmodernist, but
right.
But it is a deconstruction. It is an attempt to force a work against itself to show its underlying impossibilities,
sort of flawed
contradictions.
Thinking, right? Yeah.
Yes, and it's a thorough deconstruction of the message and the moral of the story, which is, if you are good, God will give you good things. If you are bad, God will give you bad things. If he hasn't given you good things yet, just wait.
Right. So in a sense, it's deconstructing what we would refer to today as sort of the prosperity gospel idea.
Job has no tolerance for the prosperity gospel. Yeah. But the amazing thing is, because the prose is easy and the poetry is hard, most people read the first two books or the first two chapters and understand it very well. Then they skip over all the hard stuff and they read the end. And what they come up with is the prosperity gospel.
Right.
So Job the poet outsmarted himself or herself. Don't want to close out that possibility, but the poet outsmarted the poet. And actually, the King James translators made it so difficult to tell where the one story ends. They blurred the borders. And so just because the poetry is so hard, people don't read it, and people think that Job was patient. And, you hear over the pulpit over and over again, just wait like Job and good things will come to you. And if you take that seriously, if you take seriously that Job just has to wait and not complain, and never complain about God, never curse God, and then he will be rewarded with all this stuff. If you actually take that literally, you have to discount everything that comes in between, because everything that comes in between the first two chapters and that very last tail end is designed to show you that story is false.
Yeah. I mean, the phrase, the patience of Job, is a trope in our society. And it emerges from that poor reading of it. Yeah.
The patience of Job lasts for 2 chapters.
Right.
The impatience of Job starts on chapter 3.
Let me take a few comments here, if you don't mind, and then we'll move forward.
You bet.
All right. So I'm just going back to the start here. Gary Gentry says he's joining us from Florida. It's late here, but worth the wait. Thank you, Gary.
Hi, Gary.
Justin McBride says, hello, everyone. I'm having a pretty good day. Glad you're having a good day because I just finished my project for my first grad school class. I'm excited to be listening about Job. I remember listening to an interview about Michael's book a few years ago, and it has affected the way that I look at Job and the way that I look at God as well. Oh, that's a pretty strong statement. And Justin goes on to say that I saw the book was on sale, so I just placed my order using the discount code. Thank you, Justin. We really appreciate that order. Great. And then Lee Anderson commented and said, I plan on getting a couple copies to give as gifts. Such a good book. Thank you, Lee. Thank you for ordering a couple copies, and thank you very much for your support. It's great to have you here. All right. Jacob Osler just commented, said, it really is a fantastic book. I read it about a year ago, and it radically enhanced my understanding of this wonderful scripture/poem. Great comment. Thank you, Jacob. Keep the comments coming. If you have any questions for Michael as we go along, please feel free to shoot them over, and we'll get them over to Michael. Actually, it looks like a question just came in. Chrisman Lewis, he said, could you speak about the difference of poetry? I'm going to try to read this question here. Could you speak about the difference of poetry of the friends, Job and God? Does that question make sense?
So how is the language different between the friends, Job, and God? That is a question that I cannot answer based on the original Hebrew because I do not read Hebrew. So that I am at the mercy of the translator when I read these things. And the translation I like the most of Job is Robert Alter's translation. If you're familiar with his complete translation and commentary on the Hebrew Bible, and there you get the three friends have slightly different emphases. So the comforters come in. I do not recognize any major differences in those three people's speeches or in Job's speech. But when God speaks from the whirlwind, he speaks in a very, very different voice. And maybe there's somebody out there who reads the original Hebrew and can speak to this. If David Bakaboy is out there, he can tell us exactly what's going on. I don't know. But God, Job and his friends address each other. But God simply speaks from the whirlwind. He addresses Job twice. He addresses the comforters once. But he speaks in a much more abstract way than Job does. And he doesn't answer any of the questions that are put to him, but he answers the questions that people should have asked, which is, why he's God and we're not. So I think that the language, at least in most English translations, the language of God has a very, very distinct cast to it. I am not a good enough reader of the original language to recognize the difference between Job and his comforters from a linguistic standpoint.
All right. One more question I'll take here before we move on. Scott Parker said, I very much enjoyed Michael's book. Could you comment on the end of Job, that God doesn't seem to answer Job's question, or does he?
God, as I said, God does not answer Job's question because Job is asking the wrong question. Job is asking the question, what did I do that you are punishing me like this? Which is, and Job is saying, I did nothing. So then his sort of second question is, why are you punishing me like this? And the question that God answers is something closer to if Job had asked God, do I have the intelligence to understand what's going on in your mind so that I can turn whatever happens to be going on right now into a simple moral equation? And the answer is no. I mean, that's what God is saying. God is saying, in effect, you are trying, with your very finite mind, you are trying to understand why an infinite being with infinite intelligence does things. and you're trying to draw a nice, neat cause and effect between what you did and what you get. And you can't do that. You simply are not, you do not have my perspective. You can't have my perspective. So it's ridiculous to ask me what you did that caused me to make this happen to you, or whether or not there's any meaning to this suffering, or whether or not this will all work out in the end. You simply don't have enough perspective to make those kinds of judgments. So that's the question God answers. But that's not the question Job asks. But it's the question he probably should have asked.
Yeah.
And it's the question the poet is asking us. Why do you think God, God made you get in a car wreck because, you did something wrong? Why do you think that my infinite perspective, keeping track of billions of people over millions of years, with all of these sparrows falling all over the place, you really think that I'm so little that I'm drawing a direct line into, you're saying a prayer to me and whether or not your favorite sports ball team wins? That's not rational from God's perspective. So that's what the end of the poem does. The end of the poem takes us from Job's perspective and his friend's perspective, which is also our perspective, and it tries to get us to see how silly our moral reasoning is when we apply it to God, and how silly our cause and effect reasoning is when we apply it to God, because God simply isn't subject to that. The very logic and vocabulary that we use to make these kinds of connections simply don't apply to God. That does not mean that God doesn't love us. It doesn't mean that suffering has no purpose. It doesn't mean that there is no connection between what we do and our material circumstances. It means that there's no connection that we have enough perspective to understand. And we should never, especially when we're talking to other people, we should never try to assume the logic behind why somebody else has something bad happen to them, because we simply don't have the perspective. We can't assume that it's because they're good, that they got something good, or that God is testing them, or that God is giving them enough rope to hang themselves, or they obeyed certain commandments so they got certain levels of stuff. Those are things that we like to believe because we like to think that we can predict and control everything, including God. But we can't predict and control everything, including God. And so what we do is we end up making these bizarre cause and effect relationships. The prosperity gospel is one example, rather than simply acknowledging that whatever moral logic is behind the connection between our spiritual life and our material circumstances is beyond our capacity to understand. That's what Job is telling us.
And I think even within Latter-day Saint culture, which, I mean, sometimes the prosperity gospel sort of teeters within the culture, but there's definitely this search for meaning for every tragedy in Latter-day Saint culture, right? And whenever somebody passes away unexpectedly, or if a missionary is fatally injured on the, out on the mission field, we immediately rush to these explanations, looking for meaning, looking to sort of soften the blow, as it were. And I think that Job sort of speaks to that mentality a little bit, it sounds like.
He absolutely speaks to that mentality. Whether we think that something is a reward or a punishment, any way that we rationalize a tragedy. Job's comforters in the frame tale, the fairy tale, the first 2 chapters, they wait for 7 days and they don't say a word. They just sit with Job and suffer with him and share his experience, and not one of them says a word. In chapter 3, they open their mouths and everything goes straight to hell. The point being, and I think the Job poet was very wry here, the point being that when somebody is suffering, you sit with them. You sit with them for a long time. You hug them. You understand. You listen to them. You don't have to explain the suffering. The minute you start trying to explain the suffering, first of all, you're on theologically very thin ice. And secondly, you're making a jerk out of yourself. And so rather than telling them what they should think or what they should feel, we are called to mourn with those who mourn and comfort those who stand in need of comfort, not necessarily to comfort those who mourn. We're not called to comfort people who are mourning. We're called to mourn with them. We can do that without saying a thing.
It's powerful. Let's take a step back for a second for those who maybe joined us a little bit late. And I just want to frame this for a minute. What we're talking about is the idea that there was this potentially this existing story that was, it sounds to me from our conversation, somewhat of a quaint story, somewhat of a moral platitude type story that has all the indications that it was possibly a Persian type of story. And then you've got this, I don't know if redactor is the right word, but you have this insertion from a pretty brilliant poet that sort of upends the whole thing and deconstructs it, as we would say in literary form, and sort of talks about how this doesn't work, but does so in a way that brings depth of meaning to this that's very applicable to our worldview today. Now, getting to the original sort of Persian tale, I think that the important, well, not necessarily, it's not an important question at all, but it's an often asked question. Let me put it that way. What do you think the historical basis of it was? And do you think Job was really a dude who actually existed? And if not, why is it such an oft-asked question?
I think that we have a fundamental misunderstanding of the Bible that is it's several hundred years old, but we assume that something has to be true in order to be meaningful, or we assume that something has to have happened in order to be true. We don't recognize poetry and prose literature as scripture. The Jews have always understood that they have three different parts of the Hebrew Bible. You have the Torah, the law. You have the Nevi'im, which is the prophets, and then you have the Ketuvim, which is the writings, the literature. So that's why it's called the Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. That's the end of my understanding of Hebrew. So fully a third of the Bible, I mean, the Bible is a library. Bible means library. It doesn't mean book. I mean, that's even true in Spanish. I mean, you go to the biblioteca. So the old, what we call the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, is the literature of a people. It's the writings of a whole people that they carried with them for thousands of years when they didn't have a homeland.
There is no reason in this world why a poem or a story or a novel or a work of imaginative literature cannot be scripture inspired by God in order to teach us gospel truths. I think that we have this strong belief that if something in the Bible did not happen, it can't be true. I've never really understood this well, because most of the true things in my life are poetry and novels. I mean, I'm an English professor. I find more truth in Dante than in most history. I would much rather read the Iliad than Herodotus, because the Iliad is truer. Herodotus is mainly made up stuff, but it claims to be true. So Job does not claim to be true. And was there ever somebody named Job? It's quite possible. There was somebody named Gilgamesh. There was somebody named King Arthur. There was somebody named Richard III. That doesn't mean that Shakespeare's play is a biography. So it's possible that there was a man named Job, or it was possible that this is based on something that happened to somebody, or it's possible it is a work of imagination by somebody who had poetic genius and was inspired by God to use that genius to create a poem that taught us some deep and profound lessons. And I think that the question of whether or not Job is historical is maybe the least interesting thing about it.
Right. Right. When I thought that I was really this deep soul searching kind of person, one of the things that I would often say is that if it's the truth that you're looking for, you're better off looking to the poets and to the playwrights and musicians and artists and painters, those who reflect the truth of human existence in their work, and whose work surpasses seemingly the limitations of our human capabilities. That's where you find truth. You don't look to history necessarily for truth, not in the sense of truth and meaning, right?
Now, there are several objections that often come up, and I'll try to deal with these head on. One is people ask, well, if Job isn't historical, how can we trust that anything in the Bible is historical? And the answer is you have to understand the genre. That's why I began talking about genre conventions. To the reader in the first generation of people who read the book of Job, they understood genre markers. So they could tell what was claiming to be history, what was claiming to be literature. I can tell right now, if I pick up a book and I don't look at the cover, I can start reading it, and in 2 or 3 paragraphs, I can see enough, there are enough genre markers in there that I can tell if it is a history book or a novel. I mean, I know what history books sound like, I know what novels sound like, so I'm not going to be lulled into thinking that that a novel is actually a history book, unless it's a novel that's intentionally trying to sound like a history book, but even then, there are genre markers. So understanding genre markers is the way that you can tell that something is not presenting itself to us as history. Therefore, there's no particular reason we need to read it as history. Right. Another question that sometimes comes up is that when God is talking to Joseph Smith in the Carthage jail, the Liberty jail, he mentions Job, and how could God mention Job if he weren't a real person? And I think my friend Artis Partial had the best answer to that question. And he said President Monson once gave a conference talk and talked about the little engine that could. And yet we know that that was not a historical little engine who could. You know, God, prophets, everybody else can talk about, because poetry can be scripture. I mean, that has to be understood. A work of imagination can be scripture every bit as much as the work of history can.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think that the biggest takeaway, if anything, is how fundamentally important it is to understand genre, particularly when we're dealing with a collection of writings and texts, really an anthology, if you will, of writings and texts, and not just placing the assumptions that they're all histories. And let's face it, even the histories in the Old Testament, such as the Book of Kings and whatnot, aren't necessarily histories in the sense that we look at them today either, right? I mean, they're not, they're still didactic prose for a very specific purpose. They're not necessarily using the historical methods that we established in the early 20th century.
Yeah, they're what we'd call Whig history.
Right.
They're just designed to get us to a conclusion rather than,
right.
Yeah, you know, most people now don't even write history as history.
Right.
But the conventions of academic history aren't even 100 years old.
Right, exactly. Let's go ahead and just take a couple more comments, and then we'll move forward here. We had some good comments while you were away, and let's see. Just scrolling through here. Gary asked something. I think it was Gary, and I wanted to make sure that I got it. Here we are. Gary Gentry asked, why do writings of poetry actually make it into biblical text?
Because that's what the Bible is. The Bible is all of the texts that the Jewish people at the time of the Babylonian captivity found important to their spiritual development. If I were to go, I live in Evansville, Indiana. If I were taken captive into Indianapolis and I had to take just a few things with me, I would grab as many books as I can carry, and some of them would be history, and some of them would be a biography, and one of them would be the collected works of W.H. Auden. And another one would be the collected works of Anne Sexton, because those two poets have been more important to my spiritual development than almost any other book. And if I were creating my Bible of the things that formed me, it would definitely include poetry. So the Bible was never intended to be what the modern fundamentalist imagination holds it to be, which is one big unigeneric collection of truths directly from the mind of God that can be combined in any capacity, in any combination, to produce truth. I mean, that's how you argue with the Bible. That's how you proof text the Bible. But the Bible is the Old Testament especially, but the New Testament has some very, very interesting genres in it too. If you don't understand the genre of the apocalypse, then the book of Revelation makes even less sense than it makes when you do, which isn't that much sense.
For sure.
So the Psalms are lyric poems. Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon are other works of wisdom literature. Esther is a wonderful prose story. It is not historical. There was no king by that name. That is not something, and we would have known. Had that happened, there would be a record of it. But it's a wonderful story, and it says very, very true things. So there are all kinds of wonderful types of literature, and it would be very strange if a sophisticated 1,000-year-old culture like the Jews who lived in the kingdom of Judah, if they only ever produced one kind of book. I mean, what culture only has one kind of book?
Right. Yeah. A definition that I had heard too of sacred texts, of what makes sacred texts, is really it's the community that adopts those writings as being sacred to their community. And that's so, when we look at the Bible as a collection of writings, I think it becomes clear that they earned that right of being canonical because they were important to that community. And we need to keep that in mind, right?
Yeah.
All right, let's take a look at a couple of other comments that we have here. Dallas Clough, one of the things that we talked about while you were getting back on was this idea that God is not an ATM machine, right? And that the prosperity gospel concepts that are mentioned is that it's quite common in LDS culture to use Job, given its ending, as a proof text for the idea that God rewards the faithful, especially with money, he said. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, that is exactly the wrong conclusion. It's not just the wrong conclusion. It's exactly the wrong conclusion to draw from Job. I mean, it's exactly the opposite of what is right. But that's the critique that the Job poet was making. The most likely composition of Job is this was a story that was well known to the Jews in the Persian era of the captivity. That was something that reinforced that narrative that the entire Deuteronomistic history is based on, that we do stuff and God gives us stuff. I mean, that's what people wanted to believe. The whole Babylonian captivity was about becoming more religious so God will take us back. So the poet then comes to this and says, what a horrible message this is. I mean, this is wrong. And the whole poem of Job is designed to show us that the ending of that fairy tale is the wrong moral to draw. And that's why the poet gives a voice to Job, who is only spoken about in the frame. So if we read Job to come to the conclusion, I mean, if people who read Job and come to the conclusion that if we're just patient and love God enough, he will give us a lot of stuff, what that tells me is you read exactly 2.5 chapters of Job. Because there is no way you could actually go through the entire 42 chapters, get to that end point, and still have that idea if you understood even the surface of what you were reading. Now, I don't believe that the King James Version is a very good way for us to understand the surface of things like the book of Job.
Right.
Added to the natural difficulty that it has, 400-year-old antiquated language doesn't help us at all. So I do not recommend anybody,
especially one that was trying to be poetic, intentional.
Yes. Yeah, there are so many good translations of the Bible and of Job, just of Job. I mean, there are wonderful translations of just Job that really make it clear what's going on. So the King James Version, even if you were an early 17th century scholar, would be hard to read. And it's just darn near impossible to read Job and get much out of it in the King James Version.
Right. Gary Gentry says, well said. That reminds me that most parables given by the Savior were hypothetical or stories, not stories based on real people or events, i.e. the Good Samaritan, but conveyed a powerful gospel truth. Ben Spackman, we know Ben, we love Ben, speaks extensively of genres.
A very good point about the parables. And the only reason that people aren't running around today saying that there really was a Good Samaritan and there really was a prodigal son is that we have been made familiar enough with the genre markers of parable that we don't read it that way. The genre markers are enough a part of our culture that we can recognize it. Job is no different. If we knew enough about the culture of the time, we would see exactly the same kinds of genre markers.
Great. That brings up another question in my mind. Is Job a type of Christ?
That's a really good question. And it's a harder question than people think. The whole question of typology, of characters in the Old Testament being sort of intentional forecasting of Jesus Christ, I find very problematic because it's a way to connect the Testaments together, and it reduces a lot of Old Testament stories to semi-real figures whose only real purpose was to tell us things about Jesus Christ. I think that a lot of people read Job very much as a type of Christ because of this phrase that he says in chapter 25, I know that my Redeemer lives, and we have a song. Actually, there are 6 different versions of the song, I know that my Redeemer lives, in different Christian hymn books. We've all sung at least one version of it, and it's a powerful song, and that is in no uncertain terms not what Job meant. And the reason it says Redeemer is that the King James translators were intentionally working towards establishing those types. What Job is saying in that chapter is he's actually going through all of the people that have abandoned him because of God, or that God has killed. He's complaining about this. And he says, well, okay, my cousin won't talk to me anymore because I smell bad, and my uncle's not talking to me. In Hebrew culture, there's a role called the Gaal, which is something like the fixer or the avenger. After you die, the Gaal steps in and does what needs to be done. And if that means that you don't have any children. He marries your wife and has children in your name. Boaz was a Gaal in the story of Ruth. If you have debts that are unpaid, the Gaal pays them. If somebody has done you dirty, then the Gaal kills them for you. So the Gaal is more like avenger, fixer. It's a real stretch to turn that into redeemer, but the King James translators were looking for a way to make Job a very obvious type of Christ. Now, having said that, I do think that Job is one of the most Christian stories in the Old Testament, and I think the wisdom literature really is what becomes Christianity 500 years later. But probably, to me, the most important thing about Job is that he's not Jewish. This is a story about somebody who has a relationship with God who is not Jewish. That would have been unthinkable for the Deuteronomists writing during the captivity, or the Levitical priests writing during the captivity. To have somebody who's not doing the rituals, who has a relationship with Yahweh, or somebody who has not made a covenant. But the wisdom writers were universalists. They were much more global. They were the BCC crowd of the Old Testament. So what they imagined was a relationship with God that can be universal. And that's exactly what we get in Christianity. They also really, one of the main focuses of Job is on the comforters and how the comforters really blow it by the way that they treat Job. The idea that morality can somehow be determined by how we treat other people is something you don't get in a lot of the Jewish literature. Morality is, for the Deuteronomists, is your covenant, and for the Levitical priests is your performance of ritual. But there aren't a lot of places in the Old Testament where we get a sense of morality that means how you have personal relationships with other people. And that, of course, becomes the major moral innovation, not really innovation. That is the thread of Judaism that gets picked up in Christianity, is one that is more universalist, one that focuses on relationships, one that sees God as inexplicable. All of those things do become Christian. So I think Job forecasts Christianity, but not in the way that he's usually assumed to forecast Christianity.
I like that answer. And just to sort of recap it to make sure that I'm understanding you correctly, while Job as a character may not be a typology of Christ, the text itself seems to have at least influenced later Christian thought.
Yeah, right? I think that, you really have three strains of thought, three schools of thought in the Babylonian captivity. The prophets, the priests, and the sages. Or the Deuteronomists, D, if you look at David's book, the Levitical priests, or P, and then you have the wisdom writers. And the wisdom writers have a very different gospel, a much more human-centered gospel. And that is the trend, that's the thread of Judaism that becomes what Christ teaches. So yeah, I think that
Gotcha.
Job anticipates the New Testament more than just about any other book in the Old Testament, just not for the really easy to identify reasons that we like to sing about.
Yeah.
And I still like the song. It's a fine song.
Yeah, no, it's a lovely song. I do think it is interesting, though, to note how the King James translators were really performing a proof text of Job in this case.
Well, that kind of proof texting goes all the way back to Matthew. The original New Testament writers created a narrative in order to turn every biblical story into a preview for Jesus Christ.
Right.
So that line of thinking has been with Christianity from the very beginning. So by the time that the King James writers got to it, it was just naturally accepted. Everybody understood that really it was Gregory the Great in the 5th century, Pope Gregory, who wrote the first book about Job, making him a type of Christ. So that has been with Christianity That's not something the King James writers made up, not something the Mormons made up. That is a very old reading of Job for Christians. I think that reduces what Job meant in Jewish culture. Even though he was not Jewish, the author was definitely Hebrew. So I'm very uncomfortable with most claims of typology that people live their lives as previews of Jesus. I don't think that's a particularly effective way to teach things about Christ. I think that the first generation of Christians needed to legitimate their movement by connecting it to the Old Testament, and they did that through every means available. And that's fine, I guess, but I don't think I think that there are better readings of Job than as an anticipatory symbol of Christ.
Let me take another question here from the comments. Ryan Mullen asks, can you speak about Elihu? Is it Elihu? I said, I remember his role seemed odd if he were a later addition by a third author.
Yeah, it's very, very likely and probably certain that the 3 or 4 chapters, I think it's 4, that are attributed to Elihu are a sum up from a later redactor. Because here's somebody who supposedly heard the whole argument, except he wasn't there. He comes on the line, and this is kind of a last-ditch effort to hold on. He's the last best set of arguments saying that Job must be responsible, or that the worldview of the ATM God, he is their last best representative. So I think that either somebody who disagreed with Job at some point wanted to put in stronger arguments against what the poet was saying, or somebody coming on later on wanted to make the poem even grander by defeating an even greater enemy. So Elihu is, he's the scholar, he's the smart young college guy who comes in and makes the better arguments, but they still end up being the same arguments. So, but it's very, very unlikely that the original poet put that in. It doesn't make sense. It really destroys the unity of the text. And actually, some translations of just Job eliminate it altogether.
Oh, interesting.
The more
So now to put this into perspective, we have what was potentially a pre-existing story, pre-existing tale that's being responded to in a very creative way by a poet. And now we've got possibly later emendations to that poet as well. Although those, should probably be differentiated from the original poet's writings.
Yeah, pretty much every book in the Bible works like that. I mean, there are accretions, there are accumulations over long periods of time, and that's very, very common in biblical texts.
That's the nature of the writing, right? Now, and it also seems like a lot of the biblical texts are sort of responding even to other writings that are contained within the biblical text, sort of in conversation with those writings. Does Job have any sort of interaction with other books of the Old Testament?
There is a fabulous book called Subversive Sequels in the Bible, and I can't remember the author right now. She's a Jewish scholar that argues that Job is a response to Abraham. And she points out with a lot of Hebrew linguistics, and somebody out there can probably think of the name of the writer, because it's just not coming to me because I'm old and it's late. But she argues that the names of all of Job's comforters come from place names that are in the Abraham story. And she argues that Job's raging at God for taking away his children, his 10 children, is a response to Abraham placidly accepting God's command to sacrifice his son. And that this is an attempt to say that Abraham should not have been it's a response to the Akedah. Abraham should not have been so eager, so willing to go along with God's plan. He should have been more like Job. So it's a very deep textual argument that's not just concepts. It gets into the language of it that I don't know enough to evaluate, but I find that fascinating. Probably the most fascinating opinion about Job is from the psychologist Carl Jung, who you probably heard of. Sure. He wrote a book about God's answer to Job, and his argument is that God was wrong, Job was right. Job shamed God by not giving in to his bullying, and God realized what a jerk he'd been, and that's why he had to be born as Jesus Christ to atone for all of the bad things he did to Job. So that's Jung, but I mean he was a weirdo. So
yeah, that's great.
I'm not saying that's true.
Yeah.
Job also, I don't think it's a direct response to the Deuteronomistic history, but I think the Deuteronomists and the wisdom writers were writing at the same time in Persian Babylon, and they disagreed with each other. So I think that the Job poet is responding to the prosperity gospel idea that is the basis of the entire Deuteronomistic history. Jews messed up, God abandoned them. Jews do better, God takes them back. So that's sort of the basic narrative of everything from Joshua through 2 Kings. That whole history that's Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. That whole history is establishing the point that what happens to people, is a relationship of their righteousness. And Job is a dissenting voice to that orthodoxy, what was really becoming an orthodoxy at the time that the Job poet was writing.
Let's finish up with one more question, and it's really more of an ask than a question. If somebody was to ask you to give a sermon on Job, can you give us just your 2-minute version of the kind of exegesis that you would give on Job today?
I would focus on the comforters. I think that when we enter the text, we enter as the comforters more profitably than we enter as Job. And I would say that if you read the speeches of the comforters, these are people who are looking at a man whose very existence threatens an orthodoxy that they believe in. The fact that Job is innocent and he is punished. The fact that he is innocent, he has not sinned, and yet God has punished him. His very existence is an affront to their core ideology. Rather than embracing their friend, they embrace their ideology, and they turn against their friend, not because he's done anything wrong, but because his very existence is dangerous to them. And then I would ask you to look at the people whose very existence is dangerous to your ideology, whatever it may be. Look at the people you're supposed to be friends with, whose behavior, whose sexuality, whose gender expression, whose political beliefs, one way or the other, that the existence of this person makes you question something that's very deep and core about your personal ideology, whether it's political or religious or otherwise, and ask yourself whether or not you're rejecting people in order to hold on to ideologies, rather than looking at people to see where your ideologies might be incorrect. And I think that is the most important sermon that I get from Job.
Excellent. And I think that that's going to conclude our discussion with Mike Austin tonight. We truly appreciate the time that you took to be with us. I know that it's late out in Indiana. I know that you have a very hectic and busy schedule, but I think that this was a very meaningful discussion. Hopefully it benefited those who joined us. And we also want to thank those who contributed tonight with their comments, with their questions. I think it really contributed to a good, robust discussion. If you came in late, you can catch this discussion on our podcast. I'll have this up probably by tomorrow afternoon. You can just go to the Greg Kofford Books Authorcast through whatever podcast player that you listen to your podcasts through. We're also on Spotify as well. Or you can also check this out on our YouTube channel. I should probably have this on our YouTube channel by tomorrow as well. So just do a search for Greg Kofford Books over on YouTube. And don't forget that you can get Mike's award-winning book, Rereading Job, Understanding the Ancient World's Greatest Poem, for 30% off by using the discount code JOB2020. That is all one word and it's all capital letters at checkout from our website at gregkofford.com. And while you're there, check out our other titles that are on sale, including our Back to Church sale that's going to be launching on Monday, June 1st and going through the month of June. Our next live stream is going to be with Richard Moore, the editor of the writings of Oliver H. Olney. It's a documentary history that we're going to be releasing on June 9th, and I think we're going to be talking to Richard a couple of days after that on June 11th. Oliver Olney is a virtually unknown and, quite frankly, enigmatic figure within Mormon history. He was a dissident in Nauvoo who was communicated, but he remained in Nauvoo and he recorded what he saw, including rumors of polygamy, the growth of Freemasonry in Nauvoo, and also the saints' plans to migrate to the west. In addition, Oliver was claimed to have his own prophetic visions and numerous visions and visitations by what he called the Ancient of Days. So it's a very interesting discussion about a very bizarre and interesting character. So we're going to be talking about him. He published a couple of exposés against church leadership, against spiritual wifery, that are really quite interesting. So you're not going to want to miss this one. So again, I think that's going to be on June. During this COVID-19 what's time, right? So we will be talking to him on June 11th. So look for the event invite on that one. Once again, I just want to thank Mike for joining us tonight, for giving us his time, and thank those of you who have joined us tonight as well. And we wish you peace. We wish you health, not necessarily prosperity. That wouldn't be the Job way.
You can have it. You just won't.
You can have it. Just don't. Yeah, you don't deserve it. Excellent. Signing off for now. We'll see you next time. Take care.
Right. Thank you, Brian.